morning, and this is my dear friend, Cynthia Bauer. So Cindy and I have been friends 17 years, I think we found out, coming in. We met back when I was a part of a conversation that is really diffused now, but it's called the Emerging Church Conversation, and led a discussion group of a bunch of us who were not so much radicals, I think, as people who were trying to find a way to stay faithful during that season of our lives. So Cindy and I met that way. I've been in disability services for 17 years, and before that had some intersplicing with communities like L'Arche and Jean Denier, and that's a heartbreaking story for a whole nother talk, so we're not going to do that today. But I'm just so fortunate to have Cindy here. Kupenda, just a spoiled story. It started with networks of Christians on the North Shore. So everything that she talks about has happened because people who believed in Christ on the North Shore said, people with disabilities matter. And it started out very, very small. And now it's very, very powerful and smart in ways that I can't even explain. That's why I brought her. So we're glad to be here with you today. So we are going to talk about how we met. We already did that.
I can say my side of it.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I'll be real super short. When I was living in Maryland, which is where I was before I came up to Massachusetts, I was trying to figure out how to connect to the emerging conversation, which was, again, Christians who, like you said, I think you said it better than I can say it. And that's where I met Jeff. He's actually my first friend in Massachusetts, so I'm grateful for that. And he knew that the journey I had been on with Kupenda, which we'll share about a little bit more, and my work with disabilities in Africa would end up being that Jeff would be on the board of directors for Kupenda and then for several years. And we just realized how long we've known each other, because I'm like, wait, Preston was a baby when we met. So that's how we can figure out just Preston's lifespan. So grateful to be here. I live up in Maine now, just so you know. I live up near Bar Harbor, Maine for a little while. My family property up there doing some renovations, but for a little while.
But you lived on Chewbacca Lake.
I lived down on Chewbacca Lake for about 13 years, yeah.
So today, we thought it would be good. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm doing here locally through Jewish Vocational Service Boston. Cindy's going to talk about Kupenda. We're going to talk about what we do, then we're going to open for 2 questions. We're going to talk about why we do it, then we're going to open for 2 questions. Then we're going to talk a little bit about where we think this work that we're so fortunate to do, and we love what we get to do. So we had to time ourselves very carefully to talking, because especially me can go way over. So what we do, why we do, where we think it's going. After each little break, we'll have points for conversations. And if you really want to talk, you can come hang out with us on February 6th over in the PCR from 6:30 to 8, and we can talk your ears off. So glad to have you. Why don't we start this morning by saying the Lord's Prayer together? Would that be nice? That's what Father Patrick has us do before we go on altar, so maybe that would be nice. Together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Okay, let's get started. You want to stand or sit?
Whichever you guys prefer. More casual.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, what do you do, Cindy? Let's go there.
I founded and I run an organization called Kupenda for the Children. And Kupenda for the Children, our mission is to transform harmful beliefs connected to disability to those that improve the lives of children. Do you need us to bring the microphone closer to us? Yeah, sorry about that. I saw some people with their ears. There you go. Is this better? Can you hear me better? And the reason that we exist is that so often, especially in the countries with more poverty and so on, there's a challenge of people believing that disability comes from things like witchcraft or curses, or people just not having enough faith. And I've learned over time that that's not specific to only low-income countries. I even had the unfortunate experience 2 years ago when my niece was at the end of her life, here in Massachusetts, in Newburyport, a faith healer coming to my brother's house as my niece was at the end of her life with cancer, saying that all cancer came from unresolved sin. And I was like, isn't that the point of Jesus? And that's kind of what we do, and why it's needed is we work with community leaders around the world to talk about what does the Bible really say about disability? Is it just about healing people to make them be something else than what they already are? Or is it more than that? And so what ends up happening is as we work with the community leaders like pastors, government leaders, traditional healers, which some people might mistakenly call witch doctors, to change the belief system, which then ends up meaning that people will actually do the direct service of creating schools, finding children that are hidden with disabilities, that are being abused, that are being neglected, and in some horrible cases even murdered because they have disabilities and they feel like that's a curse on the family. And what we see is long-term sustainable changes in the community where people are building schools, they're caring for the people, they're explaining to them that they are valued and loved. And in a world where only 10% of people with disabilities are involved in the life of the church globally, it's an important subject as we talk in the church today. And we call ourselves Kupenda because Kupenda means love in Swahili. And I happen to have started this 20 years ago when I was on the coast of Kenya as a wildlife biologist. And I had learned that if I had been born in Kenya, I might have been killed because I was born without my left hand. And so that really stuck to me, and somehow my career path changed. And now 20 plus years later, Kupenda is now working in 16 different countries. I'm all in Africa right now and working with multiple nonprofit organizations like World Vision, World Relief, and so on to actually train other community leaders to make their work more inclusionary of children with disabilities.
Yeah, actually been on the board with Kupenda for over a decade. In fact, we've had board meetings in this very room. So thank you for your hospitality, long before now. One of the cool things about Kupenda for me is it started out really simple with providing school fees for students. And because of our really gifted special educator partners and our Kenyan program staff, so all of our program staff are Kenyan, we're doing much more advocacy, community work, working at the community level with chiefs, with pastors. Like, it's brilliant, like the way it's evolved. And it really is owned by our Kenyan partners. And a lot of our job, and Cindy's job, is storytelling, fundraising. But we love our staff and listen a lot, and they educate us a lot on what needs to be done. Interesting too, you talk about violence against people with disabilities. You know, I don't want to start this off on a Sunday morning this way, but don't put high levels of violence against people with disabilities just in the over there bucket. It happens a lot here. About 80% of people with significant disabilities in America will experience physical, sexual, financial abuse in their lifetimes. It is very, very common, and it's a huge problem in this country. Okay, wow. I really don't want to give a lecture on that, though I should. What we do, I work for Jewish Vocational Service Boston. My daily job is connecting people with disabilities to the workforce and partnering with employers to diversify their workforce. JVS is one of the largest workforce development organizations in New England and probably one of the biggest in the country. So there's about 220 of us, full-timers, and we serve people from all populations. So we have a one-stop that serves people who are unemployed. We have over 40 coaches who work with immigrants and refugees to help them access employment. Huge issue with work permits and refugees in the Commonwealth right now, so we're hoping to see more of those come through. We don't see a lot of poor people or a lot of immigrants and refugees who don't want to work. Everybody pretty much wants to work, and that's why we show up every Monday morning and work our tails off. On my side, I get the privilege of working with people with disabilities, and our team of 16, hopefully we hire on Monday for 17, is really to do two things. One thing is to help young adults with disabilities get paid employment before they exit high school. It's really, really important. The young adults with disabilities have the experience not of an internship, not of volunteering, though those are important, and we do some of that, and it's vital. But the most important thing is for people to earn a paycheck before they exit high school. People with disabilities who do that are 19% more likely statistically to be working 5 years after high school. So if I had to pick one thing that we did, that's what I would do. I would pick working with high schoolers. Fortunately, we're really well funded, so I don't have to pick, but that's what I would pick. The second thing we do is we work with adults with disabilities and employers throughout their lifetime, people with disabilities throughout their lifetime, and employers to create pathways towards sustainable employment and career growth. So everybody is talking in Massachusetts about a hiring crisis. I would kindly and humbly submit that if we had more people with disabilities engaged in the workforce, we wouldn't have as significant of a hiring crisis. So there's a lot of work to be done on both ends of that equation, both with employers around diversity, though employers really want to diversify. They want to hire people with disabilities, but they need some support at times, and also working with the community and saying, yes, you have a unique contribution to make for the market. Our core program is Transitions to Work, which is young adults with disabilities, many of whom are multiply underserved, which my grant writer recently said that I made up that term, but I believe in it, so I'm going to keep it. Multiply underserved insofar as they have a significant disability and they're poor, right? They're resource poor. We work with them during high school to do industry-based internships in healthcare and retail so that they're mentored by staff and they get to know industries, and then on the back end, we career coach them and work with them for a full year to get them engaged with employment. So we'll serve about 88 students this year through that, and then on the adult side, we work with all kinds of different funding streams to work with people one-to-one throughout their career to grow their career. I have the best job in the world. It's super exciting to see people find their place through work and to be able to contribute. I have numerous clients, not one, but numerous, who are young adults who say, my parents have done so much for me in my life, housing and education. I just want to be able to take my mom out to dinner on her birthday. Right? I want to have enough money to do that. Or I know my parents are aging, and I want to have my own resources and not be completely dependent on resources from the state. So that's what we do. We work with youth, we work with adults, we create diversified workforce, and I could talk about it all day, but we should move to why.
Yes.
Yeah, oh, wait, 2 questions. Yeah, do you all have questions before we move on? So that's kind of what we do. Any questions about what we do? And I talk a little fast. No questions. Wow, okay. All right, let's go to why.
So in terms of what we do and why we do it, kind of, to me, it merges together, why we do what we do and what we're doing. In terms of Kupenda and why it exists, I think I mentioned to you before, I was told that I might have been killed if I had been born in Kenya, they told me, because of being born without my arm. But also, when I was born, I was the firstborn for my parents. My parents were 22 and 24 when I was born. My dad was a really new Christian, really excited about things, especially the supernatural and miracles, and he wanted to take me to a faith healer. And he thought, you know, if that happened, then God's glory would be revealed by me sprouting a hand. So far in the faith healing community, I have yet to see a limb sprouted. I was just arguing with someone yesterday about, I'm like, why is it always leg lengthening? Where are the sprouting of limbs? That's what I'd like to see. But, so my mom, who was the daughter of a Baptist preacher, and my grandfather had said, you know, I don't think that's right. She needs to make her own decision one day. But my dad eventually, after fasting and praying for many days, my grandfather, actually not the pastor, but on the other side, said, I think if you just watch, God will use this. And he said it's already started to affect me and bring our family together in ways he hadn't imagined, because I was also the first grandchild on both sides too. And so my father's belief about healing and kind of my thoughts on it being brought up in the context I was in, I did have a lot of questions about things growing up, about like, why me? I think everyone asks that when you're not born or you aren't what is seen as normal, but who's normal anyway? When I meet that person, it's very abnormal because who's normal, right? We all have our things, but it wasn't like it was always easy, but my parents, supported me to try to do everything I wanted to do and supported me to believe that I could be. Like I ended up being a person with one arm playing the guitar before the internet. Now if you Google the internet, you can figure out how to do one arm guitaring, one arm juggling, everything. But
can we make some extra money?
Yeah, we could. Yeah, it's true. But there are much better one-arm guitarists out there than me. And I was of the mindset, I think, just who I am as a person. Keep in mind that, and I think Jeff and I both will always talk to this, people with disabilities are obviously not a monolith, so not everyone that even has an arm like mine is going to be someone who wants to push and actually prove to everyone that not only was I just as good as them, but I was better. So I kicked butt in soccer, all that stuff. But I think that support that I had when I went to Africa, I ended up becoming a wildlife biologist, partly because honestly, my biggest struggle and the biggest struggle I have discovered from talking to other people with disabilities, no matter what disability type, is that physical barriers are much less of a challenge to people with disabilities than actual societal perception. Every person I talk to, regardless of the disability, will say societal perception is a much more challenging barrier. And for me, that was the thing, especially as a woman with a disability that was physical. Wondering, what do people think about me? Like, is that something that's attractive? All those different things. And even Captain Hook in Peter Pan came out when I was a kid, and I wore a hook as an arm, so that was super fun. So I think that people don't realize, we always think about accessibility as just physical, which is important, but it's also what does the community think about things? And so when I even went into wildlife biology probably because I didn't want to talk to people, which is strange because I'm an extrovert, but I was so tired of people always asking me about my arm. Even just recently, I was at a Burger King on my way driving up to Maine, and a woman behind the counter, and again, there's an interesting connection between intellectual disability and sometimes my challenges. This woman says, "How do you tie your shoes?" And I was actually wearing an outfit like this. I was wearing a dress and boots with no shoelaces. And she asked, "How do you tie your shoes and how do you button your pants?" And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm not really wearing pants or tie shoes right now. But I explained to her, I stopped, I thought it was an educational moment because I do tie my shoes, I do button my pants. But I was like, who thinks that in that moment it's okay to just ask people random questions out there like that? And so for me, when I was going through wildlife biology and I was going to the coast of Kenya, I thought I was going to be like the Jane Goodall, that kind of thing. But when I went out there for my master's degree and my research, I saw a school for children with disabilities. A year before, I'd seen people begging on the streets of Nairobi, and I had asked, what's going on here? Why is this? And I hadn't even experienced cities here. Now I know people with disabilities are on the streets here too. And he said, that's where I first learned that I would have been killed if I had been born in Kenya, according to my Kenyan professors at the time. And so when I had this thing, and I think many of us, especially when you're in your 20s, trying to figure out, where am I, what's this calling? I feel like I'm supposed to do something, but I don't know how. So for a year, I was just trying to figure that out. I'd always felt called to do work overseas for whatever reason. And when I got to the coast of Kenya to do my wildlife research on this tiny animal called the golden-rumped elephant shrew, only exists in Kenya.
I don't think that's what your friends call it.
Yeah, there's also another word for it too. So when I was I passed a school that had just started for children with physical disabilities, and when I was going by, I asked my field assistant, "Can I stop and visit?" And he said, "Actually, my cousin runs that school. He actually started that school, and that is now my co-founder and my dear friend and director in Kenya, Leonard Mbonani." And I met him. He introduced me to 15 kids with disabilities, a variety of types, who had really needed help with special education fees, and they actually were meeting in a storage shed. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll just get some friends and family to help pay for their fees. And that was over 20 years ago now. We started with school fees, but since then we realized that when we were doing things like school fees, then we'd build a classroom, we're kind of meeting the needs as they come. It's kind of like the parable of the Good Samaritan. How I think it was Martin Luther King that talked about taking it a step further. Like, we all know that story, I would assume, we're in a church, that he came along the road and said, this is the way that you're supposed to be as a Christian person, is you take care of that person on the side of the road that's beaten up. But what if on that road you find another guy that's beaten up, and then another and another and another, and you keep bandaging up wounds, at a certain point, you've got to ask yourself, what the heck is going on this road? Why are there so many people beat up? And that's what was happening for us. Like, what's the problem? Yep.
I'm actually hearing this.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's okay. And if you just slow down a
Sure.
little bit, because what you're saying is really important. I can catch a lot of it,
Sure.
but not all of it.
Okay,
Thank
sure.
The mic doesn't help.
It doesn't. It's the
Thank you, Grace.
articulation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, when we think of the Jericho Road of disability, the Jericho Road of disability is really perception and belief system around disability. If we can alter that, I've realized it changes so much. And we changed the direction of the work we were doing because we could see, like, okay, we knew that we were kind of plugging up all these holes and we're bandaging up all these people, but the ultimate cause was not being addressed. And so in 2006, we had our first pastor workshop after we had a teacher we had funded had died because she had AIDS, and she went to her pastor for prayers, and he said, the only way God will heal you is you stop taking your AIDS medication. And she did, and she died. And even though we knew what was already happening around belief system, we're like, oh, wait, this is really something we need to address directly. It's still happening, unfortunately, but it's happening less. And we have pastors recently, like, just give you an idea of how our methods work, and we can talk more about how it actually works too.
Mm-hmm.
We do a one-day workshop.
Especially on February 6th.
Yes.
From 6 to 8.
So it's a one-day workshop model where we talk about the theology of disability and healing and suffering and that kind of thing. And when we did that first workshop, you know, we realized how much was changing in such a quick time, that these pastors were literally following the Luke mandate of going out into the streets and alleys and country roads and finding the blind, the crippled, the lame. We wouldn't use those words now, but that's what's in the Bible for now. And bringing them in and having them be part of the church, fully a part of the church, so that some of these kids who were once told that they would have been killed, told that they were never going to be anything more than a beggar, are now actually leaders in their churches, leading worship services. Also, they're teachers. Some of them are actually really thriving, and that's why it's so important in terms of the job workforce. Of course, we have some kids, we're still challenged with workforce placement, and we're working on that too. But there's many kids that are thriving in ways we could never imagined. And I feel like what happened in why this work happened is there was a work already started with my friend Leonard and some other people that were really influential in Kenya. And it's like I got invited to be part of it and connect people here because I have actually learned so much from the work. And I realized that what I've learned there, we've now started doing some trainings for people here in the US, including churches, around the theology of disability based on what I've learned from the families and leaders that we work with in Africa.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I feel so privileged to be a part of Kupenda, is we really are led by our partners, Leonard and his team on the ground. They're such a gift. And I'm just glad to be here with you today. What a joy it is to do this work together for so many different years. Cindy always wanted to work internationally. I went to Bible college, and my Bible college professors told me the one thing you must not do is be a missionary. We do not need to export you. That's not a joke. That conversation really happened, which was fine by me. I got as far as I could from Oklahoma, got out to the coast, and hit the water and stopped. You know, it's interesting to hear you talk about Dr. King. We could talk about the relationship between the disability rights movement and Dr. King and the civil rights movement for many sessions, right? So the disability rights movement in America has learned a lot and is deeply connected to the civil rights movement, and just really grateful for Dr. King a week after his memorial and the work that he did. Also somebody who did not just see race as an issue to be addressed, but poverty and war. Dr. King gets short shrift. His work was so multi-layered. why we do what we do. That's why they brought me here, not to talk about Dr. King, though I like to talk about him. At core, I think this spirituality of the work that I get to do every day, and I was a bivocational pastor for 10 years before I started this work. So I do think about my practice as spirituality on my better days, on my worst days, maybe not. At the core of why I do what I do, and I think Cindy would resonate with this too, is really a belief in the image of the divine, or the image of God, that is impressed upon all human beings. And beyond that, this desire to see people flourish in creation. So not just in the image of God, but God as creator. And I think of people with disabilities as such creative individuals. And I really view my work as helping them to find that spark or their contribution. And that's really why I'm passionate about the work we're doing in Kenya with young adults, helping them find that young. And I'm really passionate about it here in America at Jewish Vocational Service, that we're working with young people and helping them find not just how they fit into the economy. If I did that, like, I could not wake up in the morning. If I thought that my job, and on my darker days, I worry a little bit about this, that my job is just to make people with disabilities a better fit for capitalism, that leaves me shaking. That's not the genius of what we're doing. It's helping people find their contribution and find a way to do that. So it's one of the projects that I'm working on is really helping people with disabilities, for instance, connect to the disability service industry in America, which is big. I mean, there are over 400 disability providers in Massachusetts that pull over $2 billion a year from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts alone. And not a lot of the people that are delivering those services are people with disabilities. I want creative, caring, compassionate, empathetic people with disabilities to access those resources to serve their own community. That matters to me. So yes, created in the image of God. And I do mean in all of their diversity. I looked for a clip to bring to you. I'm not a big PowerPoint believer. You'll have to forgive me. I was a preacher, and I always thought that was poor homiletics and unnecessary if you can tell a story. But there's a clip from a documentary called A Whole Lot More, which is about this employment program in Toledo, Ohio, called Big One, called Lot Industries. And there's this 50-ish woman who's been in a shelter workshop making sub-minimum wages for decades. Another topic I could talk about all day, sub-minimum wage. And she says, in the midst of going for a job, she's talking to the interviewer, and she just jumps tracks in her conversation. And she says, people tell me when I get to heaven, my brain will work better, and I'll understand more, and that will be a great accomplishment. And she said, I'm not interested in that. Like, if God made me this way, then I can be accepted in heaven as I am, not as who I'm not. And so that really, that's what I'm talking about. Helping people discover the image of God that is within them, and then be a creator. So that's part of the spirituality. Another part of the spirituality, I'm going to go too off track here, is related. It's really important for us to help people with disabilities find a sense of agency in their life, a sense of say, a sense of power. For individuals who often from a very early age are supported in ways that are loving and caring and intentional, but sometimes also really restrictive in environments like special education classroom, with practices that have some utility and value, like applied behavioral analysis for people with autism, for instance. It has some value. It can also, if overdone, become a prison cell that really restricts people's creativity and people's generative capacity. So that's really at the core of our work, I think, is, and especially as a leader, is helping people with disabilities find their sense of agency, their ability to say, I am, and this is what I do, but also, for me, to have staff who have a sense of agency, who say, yes, like I can work with this individual with a disability and help them live a more fulfilling life. My staff's job is to listen, to care, to be empathetic to the challenges that people have. And people have real challenges, but my staff are not paid to stay with people in challenges. They're paid to walk beside and behind people in solving those and helping them integrate into society and make a unique contribution. So agency is a really big piece of how I see the work, both for people with disabilities and for staff. When we interview staff, often a side conversation when we're on Zoom for the initial screen, and it's like, oh yes, thank you for coming. Micah, can you stay with me? One of the questions that's often asked is, do we think this person has a strong sense of agency? Because if they don't, we're probably not going to proceed from there. So image of God, agency, and then kind of the other piece is I really, really hate ableism and segregation. Hate it. Ableism is a system of oppression designed to segregate and diminish people with disabilities, and it is pernicious and real, similar to racism, same family of sexism, heterosexism, for instance, as well. I don't like it. And so I feel like a lot of our work, both at JVS, but my passion working with Cindy, is a push against ableism, and in a positive way, helping people see that disability is not a barrier, but it is a part of human diversity, and it's an invitation to a beautiful, beloved community. So that's the positive side. The negative side is I hate the oppression of people with disabilities, and I'm happy to wake up at 4:15 on Monday morning and go fight it, which I do. I also am no fan of segregation, and as a society, we have allowed and supported and funded the segregation of people with disabilities far longer than we accepted that for any other population, both through separate education, segregated housing, day programs, at times where people are taken in state transportation vans to state-funded facilities where at their worst, I kid you not, they are saying, it's January. What day in January? It's the 20th. Can somebody get the 20 and go put it in the slot? It's like, are we at Christ Church Daycare? Or are we at an adult program helping people integrate into society? So I'm very much on the integration side. This connects back to the youth side. If you train young adults properly and connect them to the community and to employment early, they're never going to end up in the January day counting, tabulating classroom as adults. So that's kind of the spirituality of our work. I'm sorry if that's a little bitey and sharp, but maybe that's why they kept me on these shores.
Can I add to that because I want to make sure we connect the two of us too, and how we, I would say all of that, what you were saying about the integration is so important, but one of the things I've also learned, people both in Africa as well as people here with different disabilities, some of them still, as people with disabilities, would prefer to be in a segregated environment. And like, for example, some people in the deaf community, I've asked them, why do you go to Gallaudet University, a deaf university? They said, when I was in public school, I was very lonely because no one else knew sign language and people didn't really want to talk to me through my interpreter. So again, that goes back to that societal perception. And if that's not changed, it's more difficult for integration to happen. I have a student that has cerebral palsy, just a minor walking gait. in Kenya, and she wanted to go to a school for physically disabled people because she'd been bullied at school and in the mainstream, the public school, and she didn't want to deal with that anymore. So there's such a larger issue of not just putting people into those situations, like way back when busing was happening around racism, it wasn't necessarily helpful to just take a person and throw them into that room, right, without addressing everything else that was going around them. You're putting people's lives at stake. And so that's why it's not just about the people with disabilities, it's all the people in the communities in which we're living that we have to deal with. As we're trying to push towards inclusion in our schools, which is very difficult, we first have to deal with the policymakers and the families that don't have disabilities, because what we learned is when we were putting children just with physical disabilities, no learning challenges, nothing, just a person in a wheelchair, the other people were taking their kids out of school because they didn't want their kids to be exposed to children with disabilities. And so it's such a big thing, and it's for all of us, regardless of your disability or not, to actually understand, like, people with disabilities are human, and anything that affects you affects them too. They want the same things. They want the same love and autonomy and friendships and everything else, but they're often, especially in the United States actually, they're very isolated. Not because people believe they're cursed, but because in the United States we just can't be bothered.
Yeah, and that's a good point about the deaf community. That's a whole nother conversation that is not mine to lead, but a lot of people just, with the deaf and hard of hearing community, a lot of them do not identify as people with disabilities. So, because they view it as a cultural piece. And to the point, if people choose to be in identity-focused groups, that's fine. That goes back to kind of the agency piece. Like, that's their choice to do that. We should stop here and ask if there are any questions.
I mean, I have so many thoughts and questions. I don't even exactly know where to start. So, my background, I'm a gerontologist. So, while obviously they are not the same, one thing I keep thinking about is it's in all of our best interest to address this, because we are all going to be disabled at some point in
We're
our life.
lucky.
You get to be
If
70. 70 or older, you will get disabled.
And disability for some people is transient. So my son was in a wheelchair last year, and now he's not. So I think, in thinking about ourselves as a community, I was raised evangelical, and we would do altar calls, and we would expect people with a disability to come up and put our hands on because they needed to be mended when they were fine. And how harmful what we've done as a church community has been to people with disabilities, like really deep harm. And then looking around and like, how many people with disabilities are coming and worshiping with us? Are we demographically mixed? Who's missing and why? And how do we as a community prepare, but also send the message that we're safe? And so in my own work as a gerontologist, when we are trying to bring people to our Council on Aging, the first thing we do is, one, representation, make sure that there are people at the front desk who look like other individuals, but also like signage. And I know we have, and that's such low-hanging fruit, and we've got our handicap painted there with the active icon, yeah.
That active icon, a lot of the proliferation happened because of conversations in the PCR, but that's a whole another talk.
Yeah, and so I actually tried to bring that icon to where I work, and what I was told by the department, our DPW department, was, we want to do this, we legally can't, because in Massachusetts, it is not legally recognized as a handicap symbol. And if someone were to get in an accident and that were there, the town could be sued. And then it makes me think of the policy work that is still so necessary and also seemingly very low-hanging and would do to be safe, to signify that we're safe, and then the policy work that we can be helping with.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Good questions.
Do you have an answer?
Oh, yes. I have all of the answers. Do you have?
Like I said, I feel like always starting with people's even desire to do those things is the first step. I would say in the church as well. Most of the time there's not the desire. People are overwhelmed by how much work it might take. But I think that even in the churches, it's still, I had a friend, this will help connect. I had a friend from Kenya who came to Gordon Conwell who had a son with cerebral palsy, the kind that required a lot of supports. He was nonverbal, intellectually delayed, and in a wheelchair, and couldn't use his hands. And he said, he's like, when I came to the U.S., there was so much for him, for resources, for education, for physical therapy. And I just thought when I went to the church, it would also be drastically different than in Kenya. And he said, I found no difference between the church in Kenya and the church in the United States. And that was very interesting for me to hear.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear you talk. And I guess one thing that I hear you saying is accessibility is not an accommodation.
Correct.
It's not an accommodation. It's not special, right? It should be there as a form of inclusion, but a form of welcome. And I guess I would just ask one question. I'm not on the property committee, thank God, at Christ Church, because I'm sure it's complicated. Here's a question I have though. What would it say about us as a community if one side of our altar, which I'm privileged to serve on and love serving on, was ramped? What if there's a ramp on one side? What would that say? Something to think about.
I am on the property committee, and it is something we've absolutely thought about. One thing that I feel like is a really powerful tool in my own thinking has been the idea that people aren't disabled, it's environments that are disabling.
Yes.
So my husband's a builder, and everybody wants a wide door, right? Nobody wants to move into an apartment where you can't get the sofa through. A 30-inch door is more expensive than a 28-inch door. And that is because building code, I think those are the numbers, but building code says 28 inches is the minimum in a new build. If it were switched to 30 inches, the 30-inch door would be the cheaper door because the 28 would be the custom, right? So I think we're running up against a couple things. One is we should have done policy work a long time ago to change code, and now we are paying the price because it is really expensive, like absurdly expensive. We have this gorgeous building and it's all concrete, and we can't just fix floors and change them. We have to demo piles of concrete where pipes and electricity and all sorts of things are hiding in the floor, which is why the bathrooms on the first floor haven't been changed except the men's room where something went wildly wrong in plumbing and we had to change it, and then we were able to bring it up to code.
We could talk about that, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to, I do kind of like bringing up points of tension, but that's a whole nother thing. Thank you so much. Bruce.
Something that caught my ear, disabled as my ears are, and what you were talking about was using that parable of the Good Samaritan and questioning the road rather than the characters in the story. And one of the things that makes me think about is all these terms that we're using now, ableism, racism, ageism, one thing they all have in common is that ism, which is a giveaway that we're talking about a systemic problem. It's not, and what Well, what are principalities? They're systems.
Yep.
So we're talking about systemic evil that the church can unify to battle in ourselves and in our culture. But some of it's an attitude shift, a big attitude shift that can help liberate us from this feeling of, well, there's nothing I can do. It's just messed up. But thinking outside of the box and saying, look, I don't have to participate in a system of evil.
I think about that passage all the time, right? And I completely agree. And I think American individualism has done us no favors when it comes to thinking as a community, when it comes to thinking of systems.
There's an ism on that one too. Individualism.
Right.
It's a system of evil.
Right. It's that's a well said. Yeah.
Although, I often speak to American individualism to say the difference between racism and ableism is you're not going to wake up one day a different race, but every one of you is a car accident away from being part of the disabled community. So, and that's more like it could affect you. It affects and that shouldn't be the motivator, but it is at the same time.
I just also want to thank you, Bruce, for saying, hey, as a person with a disability, there's so much power in saying, hey, this is part of who I am. Like, I'm a person with ADHD, right? Like, I live with this, right? And we'll get to kind of where we see things going, but a lot of it is us saying, yep, count me in. I have clinical depression and ADHD, both true, by the way. I'm in the community, right? I have age-related hearing loss. I'm in the community, right? Or whatever the case might be, right? I don't mean to impose, but I have hearing loss, I'm in the community. So I think pulling in and saying count me in because of my diversity, like, is such a powerful thing. And we see some companies doing that, and I think it's great for companies to say, hey, yeah, we see you in your diversity. Like, do that. Yep, did somebody else raise their hand?
Thank you for this conversation. We're just touching on so many different levels, both here and my question actually to you, Cindy, because we lived in Kenya for a while, and I'm wondering if your work in Kenya was compounded because of some of the tribal groups, because we had a Kalenjin friend, a Luya friend, and depending on what their disability was, depended also on their tribal group, and different tribal groups respond somewhat differently. And I didn't know whether if that's been, an issue.
So we've worked with multiple tribal groups, and now we're working in other countries like Sierra Leone and Malawi and so on. And even working in some Asian countries and South American countries now, we have seen that the issue is the same in all of them. In terms of just the basic belief around curses and supernatural healing, because one of the reasons I believe is that in terms of missionaries that are still going to these African countries, which is weird because the church in the U.S. is decreasing while the church in Africa is increasing. Like, stop coming. They need to come here now. But the charismatic movement is very attractive because it's very similar to a lot of their traditional belief systems, I think. And so they take hold of that. So there's this cross between traditional healing. Like, I think in Kenya, 85% claim to be Christian and 90% practice traditional healing. So it kind of gets merged, and also interpretations of the Bible that say, if you're not healed, it's your lack of faith. I've seen that across all the tribes and all the countries I've worked with, mostly because of the type of, I think, Christianity that has taken hold in many of those countries. And every time I'm in one of those countries and meet one more white missionary bringing that, I'm like, it's like they're working against what we're trying to do. And it's not to say healing isn't possible. It's not to say those things aren't important. If your child is on the operating floor, you're going to pray for healing. But it's when it doesn't happen, and usually healing is an exception, not the rule, which somehow it's become the rule. Like, if you're not healed, then something's wrong. I'm like, well, if you're healed, I think that's more the exception. And the Bible we talk about in our workshops wouldn't talk about healing the way they do if it happened all the time. It would just be commonplace. And so I've seen it across all of them. Yeah.
So we're at
Over time.
10:10. So Cindy, where do you see your work going? And I'll go.
Yeah. So one of the things we're seeing happening now is because of the work we did in Kenya, which now we've done in other countries. We've done trainings with pastors, traditional healers on the ground in Sierra Leone, Malawi, and so on. What that's done is brought an organization like World Relief, which was our first big pilot project in Malawi, has taken what we've done with pastors and a gap analysis we did for their church empowerment program, which goes across all 40 countries that they're working in. And they've changed it, and they now have a disability inclusion focus. And so now, because of that, I will be next month be leading a training of 30 different NGOs in Central, South America, Asia, Africa, and so on, connected to one of our funders to talk about disability inclusion, and because they're all Christian organizations, to talk about the theology of disability, because we've realized until you start talking about theology of disability, you don't realize where people actually stand. And even my brother, when his daughter was diagnosed with cancer, he's a pastor, he didn't have that kind of belief, but somewhere in the back of his mind, when his daughter was diagnosed, he's like, no, this isn't something that happens to us, we're good people. He wouldn't have said that out loud, but it showed him that that's what he thought at that time. And so people may not be saying, oh, I think people with disabilities are cursed, or if they had more faith or something. But when we start talking about it, people realize they might have a charitable or medical model where you're trying to fix them to adjust to society instead of society adjusting to accommodate them, as Jeff said, as part of the diversity of humanity. And so as we go forward, we believe the best place for Kupenda, working with our amazing board of directors, learning from Jeff in terms of the direct service we do in Kenya, trying to help kids get employed, adults now. But we think the best way to reach millions, so because of the way we've been working, last year we reached and benefited about 140,000 children with disabilities. And it's because we're not coming and setting up offices or programs around the world. We're working with the people already on the ground. And like, if you care about hunger, if you care about poverty, if you care about gender equity, you need to care about disability, because every person with a because every one of those groups affects people with disabilities more. Women in low-income countries are twice as likely to be disabled as men. People with disabilities are more likely to be in poverty, and so on. And so because of all of that, people often want to put disability as its own thing. Say, oh, well, we're focused on poverty, not disability. Like, well, did you know that at least 20 to 30% of the people in poverty have a disability and are not accessing your programs because you're not thinking in that way? And so if we can do more of that for these large organizations, we have a partnership with World Vision, for example. And as that's developing, we think we can reach millions over time. We're tiny, we're like a mosquito. We're tiny, but you can't ignore us in the room. Thanks. But a good mosquito.
I think that one of my favorite things about the leadership that Cindy's provided at Kupenda over the years is moving towards advocacy and moving towards like combating harmful beliefs around disability. It's just brilliant and really led to so much expansion of our work and with pastors, but also with Native healers. Like, if that's where many of our families and many of the children we serve are going for healthcare, then we better be educating natural healers, because that's going to impact our community. Which, she's just a fantastic leader. It's a privilege to serve beside her. Learned a lot. Where we see the work going, yeah.
I'd like to mention that I think you've come a long way. I had an aunt who was totally blind, and this was literally 100 years ago. And that was in the time when if you had a member of your family that had was blind or anything like that. It was termed that you won't let them out of the house to be seen in the other. And in her case, she did very well, and the family got her into knowing how to,
Braille?
well, not only Braille, but play the piano and things like that. And it was at a time when they put her out in a four-way, something to be broadcast. And it was, very good
That's clear.
example for other people, I think. And we went on with that and the other, but it just, people change when they see some others, and that's the most important part of money, and you can talk to people like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So thanks for sharing that. Side comment, if you ever get a chance to visit the museum at Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts, we could maybe schedule a trip. If people are interested, go. Like, it is quite something to put your hands on a raised globe that's 5 feet in diameter that Helen Keller learned the world and the continents on. And you can do that there. There's Massachusetts is the home to some of the best disability education historically, and absolutely some of the worst. And that's a whole nother conversation. But it's, for instance, Perkins School for the Blind, Fernal Developmental Center, founded by the same person. Vastly different things went on in those spaces. Where we see the work going, I'm going to be short so that you can connect with Cindy. We are going to be having a Kupenda Network event February 6th from 6:30 to 8 in the Preston Cutler Room. We have invites. It's free. You're all welcome. It's not a hard fundraising ask. Like, we really believe Kupenda is God's gift, really, but it's built on networks, not on a couple of rich people that give us a lot of money, right? And over the last couple of years, we've been really fortunate with some massive grants and some philanthropic support from institutional investors. We want to keep all that. It's all important, but we know that even that came from people that we knew that cared enough to bring our name up in a room. So we want to keep building our network. We would love to have you. I will be one of the hosts. Britta Magnuson, who also attends here, will be a host. Cindy will be here. Where we see the work going in JDS, quickly. One is seeing disability as an identity and as a community. I talked a little bit about that, about Count Me In, and how it's changed my life to be a part of the disability community, not just to serve that community. It's so I think inclusion and seeing the beloved community as many tribes, tongues, nations, and disabilities has been really powerful. 2, we work with high school age young adults with disabilities to get them connected with employment. I want to work with 14, 15, and 16-year-olds around industry education, around healthcare, biotech, city and state government. Why is that? Most people in the biggest growth industries are healthcare and biotech in Massachusetts. More people work in city and state government than any other company or industry, even Mass General Brigham. 3 is supporting parents more robustly, parent coaching. Because if there's anything that is more influential on long-term employment outcomes for people with disabilities than paid work before a high school exit, it's parental expectations of employment. That That's data. That's not just me opining. Young adults with disabilities whose families expect them to work are 21% more likely 5 years out from graduation to be working. 21% differentiators are things that I love. So we want to spend more time doing that. We can be here for questions. I know we have church. I stumbled across a poem that I think touches on some of these themes, and I have a preaching background, and you're supposed to have like 3 points in a poem, I heard, back in the day. So I'm going to give this a shot. This is a poem by Lucille Clifton, found in this book by Christian Wyman, who's a West Texas poet. I'm an Oklahoma guy, so I like him a lot. Bruce, I'm working with Peter to maybe have us have a Lenten reading group this year reading this book. It's really good, if you can get it off a back order. We'll give this a shot. Won't you celebrate with me? Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and a woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up. Here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight, my other hand, come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Thank you for your time. We can be here for questions. Thank you to Ezra. So glad to have you, Cindy. Thank you for coming down to Massachusetts.
Thanks for having me.